Wind, Sand, and Stars, Chapter 7, Part 2, Men of the Desert. Today at Cape Juby, Kemal and his brother Muyan have invited me to their tent. I sit, drinking tea, while Muyan stares at me in silence. Blue sand veil drawn across his mouth, he maintains an unsociable reserve. Kemal alone speaks to me and does the honors. My tent, my camels, my wives, my slaves are yours. Muyan, his eyes still fixed on me, bends towards his brother, pronounces a few words, and lapses into silence again. What does he say? I ask. He says that Bonafu has stolen 1,000 camels from the tribes of Air Riquibat. I have never met this Captain Bonafu, but I know that he is an officer of the Camel Corps, garrisoned at Ata, and I have gathered from the Moors that to them he is a legendary figure. They speak of him with anger, but as a sort of god. His presence lends price to the sand. Now, once again, no one knows how, he had outflanked the southward marching Rachas, taken them in the rear, driven off their camels by the hundred, and forced them to turn about and pursue him, unless they are to lose those treasures which they had fought secure. And now, having saved Ata by this archangelic eruption, and planted his camp upon a high limestone plateau, he stands there like a curtain to be won, and such is his magnetism that the tribes are obliged to march towards his sword. With a hard look at me, Muyan speaks again. What now? I ask. He says that we are off tomorrow on a racha against Bonafu, 300 rifles. I had guessed something of the sort. These camels led to the wells for 3 days past. These powwows, this fever running through the camp. It was as if men had been rigging an invisible ship. Already the air was filled with the wind that would take her out of port. Thanks to Bonafu, each step to the south was to be a noble step, rich in honor. It has become impossible to say whether love or hate plays the greater part in this setting forth of warriors. There is something magnificent in the possession of an enemy of Bonafu's mettle. Where he turns up, the nearby tribes fold their tents, collect their camels, and fly, trembling to think they might have found themselves face to face with him, while the more distant tribes are seized by a vertigo resembling love. They tear themselves from the peace of their tents, from the embraces of their women, from the happiness of slumber, for suddenly there is nothing in the world that can match in beauty, after 2 months of exhausting march, of burning thirst, of halts crouching under the sandstorm, the joy of falling unexpectedly at dawn upon the Ata Camel Corps, and there, God willing, killing Captain Bonafu. Bonafu is very clever, Kemal avows. Now I know their secret. Even as men who desire a woman dream of her indifferent footfall, toss and turn in the night, scorched and wounded by the indifference of that stroll she takes through their dream, so the distant progress of Bonafu torments these warriors. This Christian in Moorish dress at the head of his 200 marauding cameleers, Moors themselves, outflanking the Rachats hurled against him, has marched boldly into the country of the refractory tents, where the least of his own men, freed from the constraint of the garrison, might with impunity shake off his servitude and sacrifice the captain to his god on the stony tablelands. He is gone into a world where only his prestige restrains his men, where his weakness itself is the cause of their dread. And tonight, through their raucous slumber, he strolls to and fro with heedless step, and his footfall resounds in the innermost heart of the desert. Muyan ponders, still motionless against the black wall of the tent, like a block of blue granite cut in low relief. Only his eyes gleam, and his silver knife has ceased to be a plaything. I have the feeling that since becoming part of the Racha, he has entered into a different world. To him, the dunes are alive. The wind is charged with odors. He senses as never before his own nobility and crushes me beneath his contempt, for he is to ride against Bonafu. He is to move at dawn, impelled by a hatred that bears all the signs of love. Once again, he leans towards his brother, whispers, and stares at me. What is he saying? I ask once again. That he will shoot you if he meets you outside the fort. Why? He says you have airplanes and the wireless. You have Bonnefu, but you have not the truth. Motionless in the sculptured folds of his blue cloak, Muyan has judged me. He says that you eat greens like the goat and pork like the pigs. Your wives are shameless and show their faces. He has seen them. He says you never pray. He says, what good are your airplanes and wireless and Bonnefu if you do not possess the truth? And I am forced to admire this Moor, who was not about to defend his freedom, for in the desert a man is always free, who is not about to defend his visible treasures, for the desert is bare, but who is about to defend a secret kingdom. In the silence of the sand waves, Bonnefu leads his troop like a corsair of old. By the grace of Bonnefu, the oasis of Cape Juby has ceased to be a haunt of idle shepherds, and has become something as signal, as portentous, as admirable as a ship on the high seas. Bonnefu is a storm beating against the ship's side, and because of him the tent cloths are closed at night. How poignant is the southern silence! It is Bonnefu's silence. Muyan, that old hunter, listens to his footfall in the wind. When Bonnefu returns to France, his enemies, far from rejoicing, will bewail his absence, as if his departure had deprived the desert of one of its magnetic poles, and their existence of a part of its prestige. They will say to me, why does Bonnefu leave us? I do not know. For years he had accepted their rules as his rules. He had staked his life against theirs. He had slept with his head pillowed on their rocks. Like them, he had known biblical nights of stars and winds in the course of the ceaseless pursuit. And of a sudden he proves to them, by the fact of leaving the desert, that he has not been gambling for a stake he deemed essential. Unconcernedly he throws in his hand and rises from the table. And those Moors he leaves at their gambling lose confidence in the significance of a game which does not involve this man to the last drop of his blood. Still, they try to believe in him. Your Bonnefu will come back. I do not know. He will come back, they tell themselves. The games of Europe will never satisfy him. Garrison Bridge, promotion, women, and the rest. Haunted by his lost honor, he will come back to this land, where each step makes the heart beat faster, like a step towards love or towards death. He had imagined that the Sahara was a mere adventure, and that what was essential in life lay in Europe. But he will discover with disgust that it was here, in the desert, that he possessed his veritable treasures. This prestige of the sand, the night, the silence, this homeland of wind and stars. And if Bonnefu should come back one day, the news will spread in a single night throughout the country of the refractory tribes. The Moors will know that somewhere in the Sahara, at the head of his 200 marauders, Bonnefu is again on the march. They will lead their dromedaries in silence to the wells. They will prepare their provisions of barley. They will clean and oil their breech loaders, impelled by a hatred that partakes of love. Hide me in the Marrakesh plain. Night after night at Cape Juby, this slave would make his prayer to me. After which, satisfied that he had done what he could for his salvation, he would sit down upon crossed legs and brew my tea. Having put myself in the hands of the only doctor, as he believed, who could cure him, having prayed to the only God who might save him, he was at peace for another 24 hours. Squatting over his kettle, he would summon up the simple vision of his past, the black earth of Marrakesh, the pink houses, the rudimentary possessions of which he had been despoiled. He bore me no ill will for my silence, nor for my delay in restoring him to life. I was not a man like himself, but a power to be invoked, something like a favorable wind, which one of these days might smile upon his destiny. I, for my part, did not labor under these delusions concerning my power. What was I but a simple pilot, serving my few months as chief at the airport at Cape Juby, and living in a wooden hut built over against the Spanish fort, where my worldly goods consisted of a basin, a jug of brackish water, and a cot too short for me. We shall see, Bark. All slaves are called Bark, so Bark was his name. But despite 4 years of captivity, he could not resign himself to it, and remembered constantly that he had been a king. What did you do at Marrakesh, Bark? At Marrakesh, where his wife and children were doubtless still living, he had plied a wonderful trade. I was a drover, and my name was Mohammed. The very magistrates themselves would send for him. Mohammed, I have some steers to sell. Go up into the mountains and bring them down. Or, I have 1,000 sheep in the plain. Lead them up into the higher pastures. And Bark, armed with an olive wood scepter, governed their exodus. He and no other held sway over the nation of ewes, restrained the liveliest because of the lambkins about to be born, stirred up the laggards, strode forward in a universe of confidence and obedience. Nobody but him could say where lay the promised land towards which he led his flock. He alone could read his way in the stars, for the science he possessed was not shared by the sheep. Only he, in his wisdom, decided when they should take their rest, when they should drink at the springs. At night, while they slept, Bark, physician and prophet and king, standing in wool to the knees, and swollen with tenderness for so much feeble ignorance, would pray for his people. One day he was stopped by some Arabs. "Come with us to fetch cattle up from the south," they said. They had walked him a long time, and when, after 3 days, they found themselves deep in the mountains, on the borders of rebellion, the Arabs had quietly placed a hand on his shoulder, christened him Bark, and sold him into slavery. He was not the only slave I knew. I used to go daily to the tents to take tea. Stretched out with naked feet on the thick woolen carpet which is the nomad's luxury, and upon which for a time each day he builds his house, I would taste the happiness of the journeying hours. In the desert, as on shipboard, one is sensible of the passage of time. In that parching heat, a man feels that the day is a voyage towards the goal of an evening, towards the promise of a cool breeze that will bathe the limbs and wash away the sweat. Under the heat of the day, beasts and men plod towards the sweet well of night as confidently as towards death. Thus idleness here is never vain, and each day seems as comforting as the roads that lead to the sea. I knew the slaves well. They would come in as soon as the chief had taken out the little stove, the kettle, and the glasses from his treasure chest. That chest, heavy with absurd objects, with locks lacking keys, vases for non-existent flowers, 3-penny mirrors, old weapons, things so disparate that they might have been salvaged from a ship cast up here in the desert. Then the mute slave would cram the stove with twigs, blow on the embers, fill the kettle with water, and in this service that a child could perform, set into motion a play of muscles able to uproot a tree. I would wonder what he was thinking of, and would sense that he was at peace with himself. There was no doubt that he was hypnotized by the motions he went through, brewing tea, tending the camels, eating. Under the blistering day he walked towards the night, and under the ice of the naked stars he longed for the return of the day. Happy are the lands of the north, whose seasons are poets, the summer composing a legend of snow, the winter a tale of sun. Sad the tropics, where in the sweating room nothing changes very much. But happy also the Sahara, where day and night swing man so evenly, from one hope to the other. Tea served. The black will squat outside the tent, relishing the evening wind. In this sluggish captive hulk, memories have ceased to swarm. Even the moment when he was carried off is faint in his mind. The blows, the shouts, the arms of men that brought him down into his present night. And since that hour he is sunk deeper and deeper into a queer slumber, divested like a blind man of his Senegalese rivers or his white Moroccan towns, like a deaf man to the sound of familiar voices. This black is not unhappy, he is crippled. Dropped down one day into the cycle of desert life, bound to the nomadic migrations, chained for life to the orbits they describe in the sand, how could he retain any memory of a past, a home, a wife, and children? All of them for him as dead as the dead. Men who have lived for years with a great love, and have lived on in noble solitude when it was taken from them, are likely now and then to be worn out by their exaltation. Such men return humbly to a humdrum life, ready to accept contentment in a more commonplace love. They find it sweet to abdicate, to resign themselves to a kind of servility, and to enter into the peace of things. This black is proud of his master's embers. Like a ship moving into port, we of the desert come up into the night. In this hour, because it is the hour when all the weariness of day is remitted and its heats have ceased, when master and slave enter side by side into the cool of evening, the master is kind to the slave. "Here, take this," the chief says to the captive. He allows him a glass of tea. And the captive, overcome with gratitude for a glass of tea, would kiss his master's knees. This man before me is not weighed down with chains. How little need he has of them! How faithful he is! How submissively he forswears the deposed king within him! Truly, the man is a mere contented slave. And yet the day will come when he will be set free, when he has grown too old to be worth his food or his cloak. He will be inconceivably free. For 3 days he will offer himself in vain from tent to tent, growing each day weaker, until towards the end of the 3rd day, still uncomplaining, he will lie down on the sand. I have seen them die naked like this at Cape Juby. The Moors jostle their long death struggle, though without ill intent, and the children play in the vicinity of the dark wreck, running with each dawn to see if it is still stirring. Yet without mocking the old servitor. It is all in the nature of things. It is as if they had said to him, "You have done a good day's work, and have the right to sleep. Go to bed." And the old slave, still outstretched, suffers hunger, which is but vertigo, and not injustice, which alone is torment. Bit by bit he becomes one with the earth, is shriveled up by the sun, and received by the earth. 30 years of toil, and then this right to slumber, and to the earth. The first one I saw did not moan, but then he had no one to moan against. I felt in him an obscure acquiescence, as of a mountaineer lost, and at the end of his strength, who sinks to earth and wraps himself up in dreams and snow. What was painful to me was not his suffering, for I did not believe he was suffering. It was that for the first time it came on me that when a man dies, an unknown world passes away. I could not tell what visions were vanishing in the dying slave, what Senegalese plantations or white Moroccan towns. It was impossible for me to know whether, in this black heap, there was being extinguished merely a world of petty cares in the breast of a slave, the tea to be brewed, the camels watered, or whether, revived by a surge of memories, a man lay dying in the glory of humanity. The hard bone of his skull was in a sense an old treasure chest, and I could not know what colored stuffs, what images of festivities, what vestiges obsolete and vain in this desert had here escaped the shipwreck. The chest was there, locked and heavy. I could not know what bit of the world was crumbling in this man during the gigantic slumber of his ultimate days, was disintegrating in this consciousness and this flesh which, little by little, was reverting to night and to root. I was a drover, and my name was Mohammed. Before I met Bark, I had never met a slave who offered the least resistance. That the Moors had violated his freedom, had in a single day stripped him as naked as a newborn infant, was not the point. God sometimes sends cyclones which in a single hour wipe out a man's harvests. but, deeper than his belongings, these Moors had threatened him in his very essence. Many other captives would have resigned themselves to the death in them, of the poor herdsman who toiled the year round for a crust of bread. Not so Bark. He refused to settle into a life of servitude, to surrender to the weariness of waiting, and resign himself to a passive contentment. He rejected the slave joys that are contingent upon the kindness of the slave owner. Within his breast, Mohammed, absent, held fast to the house Mohammed had lived in. That house was sad for being empty, but none other should live in it. Bark was like one of those white-haired caretakers who die of their fidelity in the weeds of the paths and the tedium of silence. He never said, "I am Mohammed ben Lauzin." He said, "My name was Mohammed," dreaming of the day when that obliterated figure would again live within him in all its glory, and by the power of its resuscitation would drive out the ghost of the slave. There were times when, in the silence of the night, all his memories swept over him with the poignancy of a song of childhood. Our Arab interpreter said to me, in the middle of the night he woke up and talked about Marrakesh, and he wept. No man in solitude can escape these recurrences. The old Mohammed awoke in him without warning, stretched himself in his limbs, sought his wife against his flank in this desert where no woman had ever approached Bark, and listened to the water purling in the fountains, here where no fountain ran. And Bark, his eyes shut, sitting every night under the same star, in a place where men live in houses of hair and follow the wind, told himself that he was living in his white house in Marrakesh, his body charged with tenderness and mysteriously magnetized, as if the pole of these emotions were very near at hand. Bark would come to see me. He was trying to let me know that he was ready, that his overfull heart was quivering on the brim and needed only to find itself back in Marrakesh, to be poured out, and all that was wanted was a sign from me. Bark would smile, would whisper to me how it could be done, for of course I should not have thought of this dodge. "The mails leave tomorrow. You stole me away in the Marrakesh plain." Poor old Bark. We were stationed among the unsubdued tribes, and how could we help him away? God knows what massacre the Moors would have done among us that very day to avenge the insult of this theft. I had, indeed, tried to buy him, with the help of the mechanics at the port, L'Auberge, Martial, and Abkal, but it was not every day that the Moors met Europeans in quest of a slave, and they took advantage of the occasion. 20,000 francs! Don't make me laugh, but look at those strong arms. Months passed before the Moors came down to a reasonable figure, and I, with the help of friends at home to whom I had written, found myself in a position to buy old Bark. There was a week of bargaining, which we spent, 15 Moors and I, sitting in a circle in the sand. A friend of Bark's master, who was also my friend, Zin-uld Ratari, a bandit, was privately on my side. "Sell him," he would argue, in accordance with my coaching. "You will lose him one of these days. You know, Bark is a sick man. He is diseased. You can't see it, but he is sick inside. One of these days he will swell right up. Sell him as soon as you can to the Frenchman." I had promised 50 Spanish pesetas to another bandit, Ragi, and Ragi would say, "With the money you get for Bark, you will be able to buy camels and rifles and cartridges. Then you can go off on a razzia against the French. Go down to Attar and bring back 3 or 4 young Senegalese. Get rid of the old carcass." And so, Bark was sold to me. I locked him up for 6 days in our hut, for if he had wandered out before the arrival of the plane, the Moors would surely have kidnapped him. Meanwhile, although I would not allow him out, I set him free with a flourish of ceremony in the presence of 3 Moorish witnesses. One was a local marabout, another was Ibrahim, the mayor of Cape Juby, and the third was his former owner. These 3 pirates, who would gladly have cut off Bark's head within 50 feet of the fort for the sole pleasure of doing me in the eye, embraced him warmly, and signed the official act of manumission. That done, they said to him, "You are now our son." He was my son too, by law. Dutifully, Bark embraced all, his father's. He lived on in our hut, in comfortable captivity, until we could ship him home. Over and over again, 20 times a day, he would ask to have the simple journey described. We were flying him to Agadir. There he would be given an omnibus ticket to Marrakesh. He was to be sure not to miss the bus. That was all there was to it. But Bark played at being free the way a child plays at being an explorer, going over and over this journey back to life. The bus, the crowds, the towns he would pass through. One day, Lauberg came back to talk to me about Bark. He said that Martial and Abgal and he rather felt it would be a shame if Bark was flung into the world without a copper. They had made up a purse of 1,000 francs. Didn't I think that would see Bark through till he found work? I thought of all the old ladies who run charities and insist upon gratitude in exchange for every 20 francs they part with. These airplane mechanics were parting with 1,000 francs, had no thought of charity, and were even less concerned about gratitude. Nor were they acting out of pity, like those old ladies who want to believe that they are spreading happiness. They were contributing simply to restore a man to his lost dignity as a human being. They knew quite well, as anybody else, that once the initial intoxication of his homecoming was past, the first faithful friend to step up and take Bark's hand would be poverty, and that before 3 months had gone by, he would be tearing up sleepers somewhere on the railway line for a living. He was sure to be less well off there than here in the desert, but in their view he had the right to live his life among his own people. Goodbye, old Bark. Be a man. The plane quivered, ready to take off. Bark took his last look at the immense desolation of Cape Juby. Round the plane 200 Moors were finding out what a slave looked like when he stood on the threshold of life. They would make no bones about snatching him back again, if a little later the ship happened to be forced down. We stood about our 50-year-old newborn babe, worried a little at having launched him forth on the stream of life. Goodbye, Bark. No. What do you mean? No. I am Mohammed bin Lauzin. The last news we had of him was brought back to us by Abdullah, who, at our request, had looked after Bark at Agadir. The plane reached Agadir in the morning, but the bus did not leave until evening. This was how Bark spent his day. He began by wandering through the town and remaining silent so long that his restlessness upset Abdullah. Anything the matter? No. This freedom had come too suddenly. Bark was finding it hard to orient himself. There was a vague happiness in him, but with this exception there was scarcely any difference between the Bark of yesterday and the Bark of today. Yet he had as much right to the sun, henceforth, as other men, as much right as they to sit in the shade of an Arab cafe. He sat down and ordered tea for Abdullah and himself. This was his first lordly gesture, a manifestation of a power that ought to have transfigured him in other men's eyes, but the waiter poured his tea quite without surprise, quite unaware that in this gesture he was doing homage to a free man. Let us go somewhere else, Bark had said, and they had gone off to the Kasbah, the licensed quarter of the town. The little Berber prostitutes came up and greeted them, so kind and tame that here Bark felt he might be coming alive. These girls were welcoming a man back to life, but they knew nothing of this. They took him by the hand, offered him tea, then love, very nicely, but exactly as they would have offered it to any man. Bark, preoccupied with his message, tried to sell them the story of his resurrection. They smiled, most sympathetically. They were glad for him, since he was glad, and to make the wonder more wonderful, he added, I am Mohammed bin Lauzin. But that was no surprise to them. All men have names, and so many return from afar. They could guess, nevertheless, that this man had suffered, and they strove to be as gentle as possible with the poor black devil. He appreciated their gentleness, their first gift that life was making him, but his restlessness was yet not stilled. He had not yet rediscovered his empire. Back to town went Bark and Abdullah. He idled in front of the Jewish shops, stared at the sea, repeated to himself that he could walk as he pleased in any direction, that he was free. But this freedom had in it a taste of bitterness. What he learned from it with the most intensity was that he had no ties with the world. At that moment a child had come up. Bark stroked the soft cheek. The child smiled. It was not one of the master's children that one had to flatter. It was a sickly child, whose cheek Bark was stroking, and the child was smiling at him. The child awoke something in Bark, and Bark felt himself more important on earth because of the sickly child whose smile was his due. He began to sense confusedly that something was stirring within him, was striding forward with swift steps. "What are you looking for?" Abdullah had asked him. "Nothing," was again Bark's answer. But when, rounding a corner, he came upon a group of children at play, he stopped. This was it. He stared at them in silence. Then he went off to the Jewish shops and came back laden with treasure. Abdullah was nettled. "Fool, throwing away your money!" Bark gave no heed. Solemnly he beckoned to each child in turn, and the little hands rose towards the toys and the bangles and the gold-sewn slippers. Each child, as soon as he had a firm grip on his treasure, fled like a wild thing, and Bark went back to the Jewish shops. Other children in Agadir, hearing the news, ran after him, and these too were shot by Bark in golden slippers. The tale spread to the outskirts of Agadir, when still other children scurried into town and clustered round the black god, clinging to his threadbare cloak and clamoring for their due. Bark, that victim of a somber joy, spent on them his last copper. Abdullah was sure that he had gone mad. Mad with joy, he said afterward, but I incline to believe that Bark was not sharing with others an overflow of happiness. He was free, and therefore he possessed the essential of wealth, the right to the love of Baba girls, to go north or south as he pleased, to earn his bread by his toil. What good was this money when the thing for which he was famished was to be a man in the family of men, bound by ties to other men? The town prostitutes had been kind to old Bark, but he had been able to get away from them as easily as he had come to them. They had no need of him. The waiter in the cafe, the passers-by in the streets, the shopkeepers, had respected the free man he was, sharing their son with him on terms of equality, but none of them had indicated that he needed Bark. He was free, but too infinitely free, not striding upon the earth but floating above it. He felt a lack in him of that weight of human relations that trammels a man's progress, tears, farewells, reproaches, joys. All those things that a man caresses or rips apart each time he sketches a gesture. Those thousand ties that bind him to others and lend destiny to his being. But already Bark was in ballast of 1,000 hopes. And so the reign of Bark began in the glory of the sun setting over Agadir, in that evening coolness that so long had been for him the single sweetness, the unique stall in which he could take his rest. And as the hour of leaving approached, Bark went forward, lapped in this tide of children as once in his sea of ewes, ploughing his first furrow in the world. He would go back the next day to the poverty of his family, to responsibility for more lives than perhaps his old arms would be able to sustain. But already, among these children, he felt the pull of his true weight, like an archangel too airy to live the life of man, but who had cheated and sewn lead into his girdle. Bark dragged himself forward, pulling against the pull of 1,000 children who had such great need of golden slippers. Such is the desert. A Koran which is but a handbook of the rules of the game transforms its sands into an empire. Deep in the seemingly empty Sahara, a secret drama is being played that stirs the passions of men. The true life of the desert is not made up of the marches of tribes in search of pasture, but of the game that goes endlessly on. What a difference in substance between sands of submission and the sands of unruliness. The dunes, the salines, change their nature according to the code changes by which they are governed. And is not all the world like this? Gazing at this transfigured desert, I remember the games of my childhood, the dark and golden park we peopled with gods, the limitless kingdom we made of this square mile never thoroughly explored, never thoroughly charted. We created a secret civilization where footfalls had a meaning, and where things a savor known in no other world. And when we grow to be men, and live under other laws, what remains of that park filled with the shadows of childhood, magical, freezing, burning? What do we learn when we return to it and stroll with a sort of despair along the outside of its little wall of grey stone, marveling that within a space so small we should have founded a kingdom that had seemed to us infinite? What do we learn, except that in this infinity we shall never again set foot, and that it is into the game and not the park that we have lost the power to enter?